everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of the heartpanorama podcast. I'm your host Michelle, and today we're going to talk a bit about why reading is good for you. First off, I'd like to apologize for not releasing a new podcast episode last week. I spontaneously decided to have a little mid-season hiatus, mainly because I didn't want to rush creating the second half of this podcast season. Before we dive into today's topic, I'd like to disclaim that any mentions of brands, products, or services in this podcast, as always, are included for discussion purposes and are not paid or sponsored. In the latest episode, I announced that I'm going to talk a bit more about books and reading, so in today's episode, let's have a look at why reading is good for you. Stay tuned until the end of this episode because even though I've already given you a whole bunch of book recommendations, I'm adding a bonus reading tip at the end of today's podcast. Personally, I've enjoyed reading since I was a kid, but that doesn't mean that I always read or that I read a lot. I know there are a bunch of people who read 10 times as many books as I do per year. And there were even a few years when I was rather in a reading slump and I didn't read any book, partly because I already had to read so much for school and uni. I got tired of reading at all, and that's totally fine. Regardless of how much or how often you read, I think every page or even every paragraph you read can be good for you. Just a little disclaimer here, I'm not trying to turn people who don't like reading into bookworms, but I encourage you to stay with me here, even if it's just to see us readers' point of view. Firstly, reading is a good way to pass your time. I think the most obvious benefit of reading is that you have something to pass your time with when you're bored or when you're waiting for something. For instance, I often take a book to my doctor's appointments just in case I'm stuck in the waiting room for more than 30 minutes. Secondly, it's a great way to calm down. Another good aspect of reading, in my opinion, is that it helps you calm down and relieve stress. I'm not sure exactly how to describe it, but I feel like reading has a way of grounding you. Thirdly, it's a good distraction. A bit connected to the calming aspect is that you can distract yourself by reading. Especially fictional literature can help you escape reality for a while, which I think is very important nowadays. Even when there's not a global pandemic going on, it's good to take your mind off of things sometimes because we live in a society with such fast-paced routines, and that can't always be good for our mental health. The fourth aspect is stimulate imagination. One major difference between reading a book and just watching a movie is that reading stimulates your imagination. There are usually no pictures in a novel, so all you can do is to create the images in your own mind. You can take the written words and interpret them in a way that you'd like to imagine the characters and their surroundings. I really love this aspect of reading because it somehow trains your mind to do more than just your everyday tasks. The fifth aspect I'd like to list here is about relating to the characters. So what I enjoy a lot about reading novels is that you get to know the characters better than characters in a movie because you spend more time with the book. Also, you might relate to at least one of the characters, which I think is easier with book characters because you get to know them better. Point number 6 is the articulation. So through reading, you can also learn how to properly articulate your ideas. This is a major skill reading helps you build, in my opinion. Especially when you're a writer, no matter if professional or hobby writer, reading can be very useful. For example, you can expand your vocabulary, but you can also gather knowledge on how to handle different scenes or scenarios in a story. Lastly, there's also an educational aspect of reading. This could be either the development of your reading skills through reading different sorts of genres, but you can also learn different facts. Obviously, you'll learn a lot about a specific subject in nonfiction literature, but also novels contain interesting facts hidden here and there. Most authors do an extensive research on the topic their story revolves around, so you at least get the gist of the subject. Also, I think you can learn a lot about different types of people and how to read their personalities, as authors describe different characters, and I believe they have a good eye for discovering the little details of one's personality. You see, there are many good reasons for picking up a book and take some time to read. How about you? Do you enjoy reading? If so, what are your favorite aspects of reading? Can you add anything to the aspects I've talked about here? Please let me know in the comments. And now, just as promised, here's my bonus reading tip. The Flat Share by Beth O'Leary. This story is about Tiffy and Leon. Tiffy has to move out of her ex-boyfriend's apartment and is looking for a place to stay, whereas Leon is looking for a flatmate to share his rent with. The twist in the story is that as Leon is working night shifts, he's only at home during the day, and Tiffy has the flat to herself in the evenings and mornings. So the two main characters actually never get to meet each other in person for months, which is really interesting. Apart from the very unusual way their friendship and relationship develops, I love how the book also addresses more serious topics like emotional abuse and family issues. Also, it's written from the two protagonists' points of view, so you get to know them both better. It usually takes me the first 100 pages of a book to get into the story, but with this one, I was already hooked after the first 20 pages, so that means something. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads, and I absolutely recommend it. And so we've reached the end of today's podcast. It turned out a bit shorter than I actually intended. I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless, and maybe it encourages you to pick up one book or another, make a cup of tea, and wrap yourself into a cuddly blanket for a nice reading session. Please leave a like and a comment and subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss the next episode. Next week, I'll address the facets of the modern-day reading experience. Until then, stay safe and healthy. Bye!